When you imagine medicine in the past, you probably think of herbs, leeches, or bloodletting. But for centuries, many people believed that songs themselves could heal wounds. It wasn't just poetry or metaphor. In monasteries, battlefields, and even rural villages, the idea that your voice could knit flesh back together or ward off infection was treated as a serious tool of survival. You live in a world where aspirin and antibiotics exist, but if you were a soldier in the year 1200, cut open on a muddy battlefield, your options looked very different. You might be laid on a stretcher in a monastery infirmary, and instead of being stitched with precision, a monk would stand at your side and begin to chant. His low voice would roll through the stone halls, echoing against the damp walls. To him, this wasn't a performance, it was treatment. Because the human voice, to ancient and medieval thinkers, wasn't just sound, it was vibration. And vibration meant power. The origins of this belief go back as far as written history. The Egyptians carved hymns to Isis and Sekhmet, goddesses of healing, onto temple walls. Priests believed that singing these hymns over an open wound could call down divine intervention. The Greeks took the idea further. Pythagoras, the philosopher, better known for his triangles, argued that the entire universe was made of musical harmony. If the stars could be described in ratios of sound, why couldn't a broken arm? In fact, Greek physicians often prescribed specific melodies for illnesses. A fast-paced rhythm might be suggested for lethargy, while a slow, steady chant was thought to calm fevers. Imagine lying in a stone villa, sweating through malaria, while a healer softly strummed a lyre at your bedside. To us, this seems quaint, maybe even foolish. But you have to remember, without microscopes, disease was invisible. The best people could do was look for patterns. And one pattern everyone knew was music. They saw its effect on mood, on crowds, on the pace of work. Why wouldn't it also influence the pace of healing? By the medieval era, this belief was tightly woven into Christian practice. Monks across Europe sang Gregorian chants, not just during worship, but also in infirmaries. The chants were believed to purify the air around the sick, pushing away harmful spirits. Picture it. A wounded knight lies on a straw pallet, his armor dented and his skin torn. He expects the sting of vinegar or the fumbling of crude stitches. Instead, the brothers gather and begin to sing. The slow, hypnotic notes rise and fall, echoing in perfect unison. For the patient, half-conscious and feverish, the sound may have felt like medicine on the battlefield itself. Some chroniclers note that healers would hum or sing quietly as they cleaned wounds. A superstition held that the wound would close more swiftly if the healer's breath carried sacred words. In a world where infection killed more than the blade itself, any method of reassurance mattered. What's fascinating is that modern research has discovered kernels of truth in these practices. While singing obviously cannot stitch a wound, music does influence the body. Breathing, chanting, forces slow, steady breaths. This can increase oxygen intake and lower stress. Heart rate. Group singing synchronizes heartbeats, lowering blood pressure, pain perception. Studies today show music therapy reduces pain by distracting the brain and releasing endorphins. So while a medieval monk didn't know what endorphins were, his chants may genuinely have calmed a patient's pain or steadied their breathing. What he described as healing with song might have been the earliest form of music. Therapy. It wasn't just monks and philosophers who held this belief. Ordinary villagers did too. In rural Europe, mothers sang lullabies, not just to soothe babies, but to ward off fevers. Farmers hummed while applying poultices, believing the vibration of the voice sealed the medicine inside the wound. Even in far-off cultures, the same instinct appeared. Among the Navajo and other indigenous peoples of North America, healing ceremonies used songs as integral tools. A wound wasn't just a cut in the flesh. It was a disruption in the balance of the world. Singing restored harmony. This raises a fascinating question. Did cultures across the globe independently notice that music altered human perception of pain? Or did they simply turn to sound because it was the most universal tool humans had? Even as medicine advanced in the Renaissance, the idea of sonic healing didn't vanish. Doctors like Athanasius Kircher in the 1600s wrote thick treatises on how different instruments affected the human body. He described organs as vessels of sound and believed certain notes could speed blood through the veins, and ordinary people kept the practices alive. Folk healers in Germany sang healing rhymes over burns. Sailors on long voyages believed humming over cuts could prevent them from festering. The tradition wasn't mocked, it was respected. Here's what makes this story boring history. Most of these chants weren't grand rituals. They were simple, repetitive sounds. A healer might chant the same 3 words for hours, their voice hoarse and droning. Villagers might hum without melody at all, producing a low buzzing sound like bees. To us, this would seem monotonous, maybe even irritating. But to them, monotony was part of the cure. The repetition created a trance, a sense that time was suspended, that healing was underway. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. And in survival, even the smallest comforts could mean the difference between life and death. So when you picture the past, don't just imagine herbs and steel. Imagine the sound of voices in stone corridors, low and steady, trying to knit wounds together with nothing but vibration. Imagine a mother humming over a fevered child, or a soldier whispering a song to himself while binding a cut. The belief that singing could heal wounds wasn't just superstition. It was a universal human instinct to meet pain with sound, to drown out fear with rhythm. But here's the unresolved question. Did they truly believe the voice could close wounds? Or did they simply know, deep down, that music was the only medicine they could always carry with them? When we left off, you saw how singing was used as a form of comfort and healing. But beliefs this widespread never stay simple. They grow into rituals, laws, and debates. By the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the practice of using sound as medicine was everywhere, and so were its critics. If you stepped into a village in 14th century Germany and suffered a deep cut, you might not go to a physician at all. Instead, you'd call upon a Segenfrau, a blessing woman. Her treatment wasn't ointment or stitches. She would sit you down, bind the wound with cloth, and then begin to chant an incantation. The chants often blended Christian and pagan elements. One famous German healing rhyme began with a description of Christ walking in the fields, then slipped into repetitive syllables that sounded almost nonsensical. Words meant not to be understood, but to be felt. The rhythm mattered more than meaning. Elsewhere, in Scandinavia, the Galdr tradition singing magical spells was common. A healer might sing to bind the blood, repeating a verse over and over until the bleeding slowed. Imagine the psychological comfort this gave in a time when losing blood often meant death. These weren't isolated oddities. Across Europe, chants for healing wounds, burns, and fevers were written down in manuscripts. In many cases, these were passed from healer to apprentice, almost like recipes. But, unlike a recipe, the emphasis was on voice, the precise intonation, the pauses, the endurance of repeating the words until the healer's breath grew ragged. Of course, not everyone believed. As medicine began to professionalize, university-trained physicians started dismissing folk healers as superstitious. By the 13th century, medical faculties in places like Paris and Bologna were pushing for more rational explanations of health. Based on Galen's humoral theory, to them, music might influence emotions, but to claim it could close a wound was absurd. Some even mocked the practice, writing in satirical tracts that peasants would rather have a rhyme than a salve. Many of those same university physicians recommended listening to music for health, particularly for mental illness. They believed a melancholic patient could be lifted by joyful songs or instruments. They didn't see the contradiction. Music could heal sadness, but not a cut. The tension only grew. Church authorities sometimes tolerated chants as harmless, but others condemned them as superstition or even witchcraft. A healer singing strange syllables over wounds could quickly find herself accused of summoning dark forces rather than healing. By the 1500s and 1600s, the scientific revolution had arrived. A Jesuit polymath believed sound waves literally moved blood and organs. He wrote about how low tones might loosen blockages, while high tones tightened muscles. To him, the body was an instrument and disease, a matter of being out of tune in England. Some natural philosophers argued that chants calmed patients because the rhythm of the voice resembled the heartbeat, regulating the body's natural pulse. Others thought vibrations might shake loose bad humors from wounds. This sounds strange, but remember, this was the same period when people thought disease came from bad smells, miasma. Vibration seemed no more ridiculous than air itself carrying illness. These attempts to rationalize sound were clumsy, but they show an important point, even as skepticism rose. The idea of sound as medicine refused to die. It simply adapted to new theories. One of the most striking things about this history is how ordinary people navigated between faith and skepticism. If you were a farmer in 1600, you might consult a barber surgeon for a nasty wound. He would cauterize it with hot iron, brutal but effective against bleeding. Then, as you lay recovering, your family might hire a singer or healer to chant over the wound anyway. It wasn't either or, it was both. Practical treatment for the body and sonic comfort for the spirit. To them, there was no contradiction. Why not cover every possible angle when survival was at stake? This duality mirrored the way people approached religion and medicine in general. You could pray for healing and also drink bitter herbal concoctions. You could trust in saints while also rubbing goose fat into a cut. Sound was simply another layer in the arsenal of survival. But make no mistake, healing with sound wasn't just personal, it was political. Who had the right to sing a wound closed? Who was authorized? In many places, The church tried to control the practice by sanctioning only certain chants, usually in Latin, drawn from scripture. Folk healers who used vernacular rhymes could be branded suspicious. Meanwhile, physicians at universities lobbied for state recognition, insisting that trained medicine, not peasant songs, should be trusted. This tension sometimes flared into open conflict. Records from witch trials in the 16th and 17th centuries reveal cases where women were accused of sorcery simply for singing over cuts or burns. The same act that comforted a child in one context could be branded heresy in another. So, singing as medicine was never just about health. It was about power, who controlled knowledge, who defined science, and who was allowed to care for the sick. And yet, despite critics' trials and scientific revolutions, the practice endured. In rural villages, far from universities, people continued to chant. Mothers hummed, sailors sang, soldiers whispered. Even if city doctors scoffed, the belief lingered where it mattered most, among those who had no other medicine. By the 18th century, with the rise of hospitals and surgery, the practice began to fade in the West, but in indigenous and non-Western traditions, it remained strong. Shamans in Siberia, healers in Africa, medicine singers in the Americas, all continued to use sound as a cornerstone of health, and even in Europe, traces remained. Soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars reported comrades singing quietly over each other's wounds, out of habit more than belief. The idea had become instinct. When someone hurts, you sing. At first glance, this history feels small, just a bunch of people humming into wounds. But if you think about it, it tells you something profound about humanity. We always look for patterns. Even in suffering, we cling to rituals, even when skeptics laugh, and when medicine is out of reach. We fall back on the one instrument every human carries, the voice. The story of singing as healing isn't just about superstition. It's about survival, comfort, and community. So here's the paradox. Sound as medicine was mocked by scholars, feared by the church, and eventually abandoned by doctors. And yet, it kept showing up in fields, in homes, in hospitals, like a quiet undertone beneath the official story of medicine. The singing never stopped. But here's the unresolved thought. If science today proves that music can lower pain and speed recovery, were the old singers really wrong, or were they just describing the truth in the only language they had? By the 19th century, the image of a healer chanting over wounds had all but disappeared from Western hospitals. The rise of scientific medicine, anesthesia, germ theory, antiseptic surgery pushed older practices into the shadows. But like many ideas dismissed as superstition, the belief that singing could heal never vanished entirely. Instead, it waited in silence, resurfacing centuries later in a new form. Music therapy. Walk into a European hospital in the 1850s, and you would find a world of steel, chloroform, and antiseptics. Surgeons in blood-stained aprons worked in crowded wards. Their tools gleamed. Their movements were brisk. What you would not hear, however, was singing. The new age of medicine valued precision and sterility. Voices were not instruments of healing. They were noise. Nurses might hum quietly to patients, but doctors dismissed the idea as childish. In medical textbooks, music was mentioned, if at all, as entertainment, not treatment. This shift wasn't just practical, it was cultural. The Enlightenment had elevated reason above ritual, science above superstition. A chant no longer seemed like medicine. It seemed like a relic of ignorance. Yet outside the walls of hospitals, in villages and households, the humming never stopped. Mothers still sang over fevers. Soldiers on campaign still muttered songs to themselves while bandaging wounds. The belief had become instinct, woven into daily life, even if it no longer carried the authority of medicine. Sometimes, the survival of old practices depended on geography. In rural Scandinavia, healing chants persisted well into the 20th century, passed from elders to children in isolated communities. In parts of Eastern Europe, folk healers still used whispered rhymes over cuts and burns, even as modern doctors became common, and outside of Europe, traditions thrived. Among indigenous communities in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, singing remained a core part of healing rituals. Here, sound was never seen as separate from medicine. It was medicine. The West may have declared sonic healing obsolete, but other cultures quietly carried the torch. And eventually, science would circle back to meet them. By the mid-20th century, researchers began noticing what healers had intuited for centuries. Music profoundly affects the body. During World War II, doctors observed that soldiers who listened to music during recovery reported less pain and faster healing. This wasn't mystical, it was measurable. Hospitals began experimenting with music in wards. Patients awaiting surgery who listened to calming songs showed lower heart rates and anxiety levels. By the 1950s, the field of music therapy was formally recognized, with trained practitioners working alongside doctors. And here's the twist. Many of the benefits described by modern therapists, reduced pain, lowered blood pressure, improved mood, sound almost identical to the promises of medieval chants. The difference: today, we measure them with heart monitors and chemical analysis, not manuscripts and rhymes. What's striking is how modern explanations mirror the old ones. Just with new language, medieval monks said chants purified the air. Today, we say singing regulates breathing and improves oxygen flow. Folk healers claimed songs sealed the wound. Now we understand that music distracts from pain and lowers stress hormones, which aids the body's natural healing processes. Shamans spoke of restoring harmony. Modern scientists describe restoring balance in brain chemistry. Different words, same observation. Sound changes the body. What makes this story so quietly fascinating is that it isn't about miracles. Singing never literally stitched a wound shut, but in a time when infection, fever, and pain were inescapable, the human voice was the most reliable comfort available. The chant may not have cured, but it calmed. It gave patients hope. It gave healers something to do besides wait. And in survival, that mattered as much as medicine itself. Think of the countless nameless people who lay in dark rooms, listening to a voice in the night, and felt, if only for a moment, that the world was less frightening. That is the boring, overlooked truth. Healing was as much about the spirit as the flesh. Now, in hospitals around the world, you'll find music therapy programs once again. Patients recovering from surgery listen to soft rhythms. Children in oncology wards sing as part of treatment. Even dementia care uses songs to restore fragments of memory. It seems modern science after centuries of dismissing the idea, has come full circle. We no longer believe in magic rhymes to seal wounds, but we do recognize that sound helps the body heal. The practice didn't die, it evolved. So the next time you hear a lullaby, a chant, or even a soldier's quiet song, remember, you are witnessing one of humanity's oldest medicines. It may not be written in a prescription pad, but it lives in every voice. The belief that singing could heal wounds wasn't just superstition. It was a survival strategy, an instinct, and in the end, a truth science has only recently begun to validate. And here's the final thought to carry with you. If something as simple as a song could once stand between life and death, what other boring human instincts might we still be underestimating today? Today, when you sprinkle a little salt on your food, you barely think about it. A shaker on the table, a pinch in boiling water, it's just another seasoning. But for most of human history, salt wasn't ordinary. It was survival itself. Nations rose and fell on it. Wars were fought over it. Fortunes were made, lives were lost, and entire roads and cities existed for no other reason than to move salt from one place to another. Salt is boring. It sits quietly in kitchens, white, but in the past, this plain mineral was power. Before refrigeration, salt was the only way to preserve food long term. Meat spoiled quickly. Fish rotted in days. Vegetables wilted. Salt changed that. When rubbed into flesh or packed into barrels, it slowed decay, making food last through winters and long voyages. To live without salt was unthinkable. Armies needed it to feed soldiers. Sailors needed it to survive months at sea. Villages needed it to carry them through harsh seasons. If you controlled salt, you controlled life itself. This explains why governments taxed it heavily, why cities grew around it, and why people risked everything to get it. Salt wasn't just flavor, it was security. Long before asphalt highways, Europe and Asia were crisscrossed by what were literally called salt roads. The Romans had one of the most famous, the Via Salaria, which carried salt from the Adriatic coast deep into the Italian peninsula. Soldiers marched along it, merchants hauled sacks of crystals, and villages thrived where caravans stopped. Imagine trudging down such a road in the 2nd century BCE, donkeys groaning under the weight of salt blocks, guards watching for bandits, inns full of travelers trading gossip alongside salt. Every stone laid on that road was a reminder. This plain white substance kept the empire alive, and Rome wasn't unique. In China, entire dynasties depended on salt taxation. In Africa, camel caravans crossed the Sahara carrying salt slabs from the mines of Tagaza. These slabs were so valuable that traders sometimes treated them like currency itself. To hold a chunk of salt was to hold wealth. That phrase, worth one's salt, it isn't just a saying. Roman soldiers were often paid partly in salt, the origin of the word salary. Imagine working months under the scorching sun, and instead of coins, you receive a pouch of salt crystals. To us, that sounds absurd. To them, it was logical. Salt bought food, protected life, and could be traded anywhere, even in medieval Europe. Taxes on salt were some of the most hated and unavoidable. You could avoid silk or spices, but you couldn't avoid salt. Without it, you starved. because salt was essential. It caused conflict. Wars broke out over salt mines and trade routes. In 1540s France, a peasant uprising known as the Gabel Revolt was triggered by a salt tax. Entire regions rioted because the government tried to control who could buy, sell, or even carry salt. In China, smuggling salt was a crime punishable by death. Yet smugglers still risked it, hauling contraband salt across rivers and mountains, because the profit was too great and demand too universal. It's strange to think of people hiding bags of salt as if it were narcotics, but to them, salt was survival. That's why governments wanted to control it. That's why people were willing to die for it. For ordinary people, salt wasn't grand politics. It was daily life. Farmers salted butter to make it last through winter. Housewives carefully measured salt for pickling vegetables. Sailors packed fish in barrels of salt, knowing their lives depended on those barrels not spoiling. And it wasn't just about food. Salt cleaned wounds, tanned hides, preserved corpses, and was used in countless mundane tasks. Every household needed it constantly. The absence of salt wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Look closely at history, and you see salt everywhere as a quiet symbol of control. Cities like Salzburg in Austria literally grew rich from salt mines. The Venetian Empire's wealth rested heavily on controlling salt trade routes in the Mediterranean. Even the British Empire, centuries later, used salt taxes in India as a tool of control, sparking Gandhi's famous Salt March protest in 1930. What's remarkable is how invisible this power often was. Salt rarely makes the headlines of history books. You read about kings, wars, and revolutions, but behind them, in the background, was always salt. Soldiers marched because they had rations. Cities thrived because trade passed through. Empires survived because their people didn't starve in winter. So when you look at a simple salt shaker today, you're holding the key to civilizations. This boring mineral, so cheap now, once built empires, fueled wars, and kept entire populations alive. But here's the unresolved question. Was salt truly powerful on its own? Or was it only powerful because humans couldn't imagine life without it? If Section 1 showed you how salt built empires, Section 2 shows you how it seeped into the imagination. Because salt wasn't only survival, it was spiritual. Across centuries and cultures, these plain white crystals carried meanings of purity, protection, and danger. To spill salt, to bless with salt, to curse with salt. All of these were acts loaded with significance. One of the oldest associations with salt is purity. It made food last. It cleansed wounds. It purified meat for sacrifice. No wonder religions adopted it as a sacred substance. In ancient Rome, salt was offered in nearly every religious ceremony. Priests sprinkled salted flour on altars, believing it carried prayers more effectively to the gods. In Judaism, salt is still part of ritual. The Sabbath bread is dipped in salt as a reminder of the temple sacrifices. In Christianity, salt appears in baptismal rites and blessings. Medieval priests sometimes gave catechumens a pinch of salt on the tongue to symbolize wisdom and protection. Imagine sitting in a dark stone church in the 12th century. A priest sprinkles salt into holy water, then flicks droplets onto the congregation. To him, this wasn't seasoning, It was a weapon against corruption, a symbol of the incorruptible. Beyond religion, salt became one of the most widespread tools of folk belief. Farmers scattered salt at the edges of their fields to ward off evil spirits. Mothers placed salt near cradles to protect infants from witches. Travelers carried small pouches of salt as amulets against bad luck. And then there's the most famous superstition of all. Spilling salt brings misfortune. This belief is ancient, likely tied to salt's value. Wasting it was not only costly, but a sign of disorder. By the Renaissance, artists even painted Judas Iscariot knocking over a salt cellar at the Last Supper, a subtle clue to his betrayal. The cure for spilled salt: toss a pinch over your left shoulder. Why the left? Because that's where evil was believed to lurk, whispering into your ear. The pinch of salt blinded the devil before he could take advantage of your mistake. Salt wasn't only sacred, it was destructive. To salt the earth meant to curse it, to ensure nothing would grow. The Romans famously did this to Carthage after the Punic Wars, symbolically scattering salt to mark the city as eternally barren, though historians debate whether this actually happened. In the Middle Ages, conquerors sometimes salted fields to punish rebels. The act turned survival itself against the defeated. Salt, usually the preserver of life, became the guarantor of death. Salt also carried social meanings. In many cultures, sharing salt was a sign of loyalty. To eat a man's salt meant you were bound by hospitality, forbidden from betraying him. In Arab traditions, salt pacts were sacred. Once you shared it, you were obligated to friendship. Even marriage rituals used salt. In parts of Eastern Europe, couples received bread and salt at weddings, symbols of prosperity and endurance. Salt was permanence. Just as it preserved meat from decay, it symbolized the preservation of love and union. What's striking is how ordinary these rituals were. Farmers scattering salt before planting. Housewives carefully sprinkling salt on thresholds. Sailors throwing pinches of salt into the sea for safe passage. None of these acts were dramatic. They were routine, repeated thousands of times by ordinary people who rarely questioned why. This is what makes it boring. History, the invisible thread of habit that shaped lives. No single act changed the world, but collectively, these rituals gave salt an aura far greater than its physical form. As rational science grew in the Enlightenment, thinkers mocked these rituals as silly superstition. Philosophers sneered at the idea that salt could repel demons or preserve marriages. But ordinary people didn't abandon the beliefs. Why should they? Science could explain medicine and mechanics, but it didn't erase centuries of habit. Even today, echoes remain. Spilling salt still makes people uneasy. Bread and salt are still offered in Slavic homes as a gesture of welcome. Rituals persist long after their original logic has faded across cultures. The use of salt as ritual reveals something universal. Humans took the one substance they could not live without and gave it symbolic weight. Salt was both mundane and magical. It preserved flesh, so why not preserve spirit? It purified meat, so why not purify souls? And so, from Rome to India, from Jewish temples to Slavic kitchens, salt became one of the most quietly powerful symbols in history. So salt wasn't just economics. It was ritual, superstition, and symbol. It guarded fields, sealed marriages, marked loyalty, and cursed enemies. It shaped not only how people survived, but also how they imagined survival itself. But here's the unresolved question. Did salt gain its sacred power because it was essential to life? Or did humans grant it power precisely because it was so plain, so ordinary, that they needed it to mean more? By now, you've seen how salt preserved food and shaped rituals. But history rarely leaves vital resources untouched by power. Once governments realized how dependent people were on salt, they began to control it, to tax it, to monopolize it, to use it as leverage. And in doing so, they created centuries of unrest, riots, and even revolutions in medieval and early modern France. Salt was at the center of one of the most infamous taxes in history, the gabelle, introduced in the 14th century and lasting until the French Revolution. It required every household to buy a fixed amount of salt at inflated prices from government stores. The system was not only oppressive, but uneven. Some provinces paid little or nothing, while others were crushed by heavy salt taxes. This created a black market where smugglers, called fauconniers, false saltmen, risked their lives to supply cheaper salt. Thousands were arrested. Some were executed. Think about it. People smuggled sacks of salt the way others smuggled gold or gunpowder. But salt wasn't luxury. It was necessity. To deny people affordable salt was to deny them food preservation itself. No wonder resentment boiled. By the late 18th century, hatred of the gabelle was so intense that when the French Revolution erupted in 1789, abolishing the salt tax was among the first demands. Salt didn't cause the revolution, but it was one of the everyday miseries that made people ready to rise. On the other side of the world, salt was no less political. For over 2,000 years, Chinese dynasties operated one of history's longest-running state monopolies, control of the salt trade. From the Han Dynasty onward, war salt revenue became a pillar of government finance. Merchants who transported salt could become enormously wealthy, but always under the watchful eye of officials. Smuggling was common and harshly punished. Yet, the monopoly worked. Dynasties leaned on it to fund armies, build infrastructure, and maintain control over vast territories. But like France, this control came at a price. Peasants bore the burden, and resentment simmered. In times of crisis, salt unrest often boiled over into rebellion. It was a reminder that no matter how mighty an empire, its stability could rest on something as small as grains of salt. Fast forward to the 20th century, and salt again became a symbol of resistance. In colonial India, the British imposed heavy taxes on salt, forbidding Indians from producing or selling it themselves. Even the poorest peasants, gathering salt from coastal flats, had to pay. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi launched one of the most famous acts of civil disobedience in history, the Salt March, over 24 days. He and his followers walked 240 miles to the Arabian Sea, where Gandhi bent down, scooped up a handful of salt, and broke the law. It was a simple gesture, but a powerful one. Salt, ordinary, universal, necessary, became the symbol of Indian resistance. The march ignited protests across the nation, and though independence was still years away, it showed the world that power could be challenged with something as small as a pinch of salt. From France to China to India, salt reveals a pattern. When governments tried to control it too tightly, people resisted, not because salt was glamorous, but because it was inescapable. You could avoid silk or spices, but you couldn't avoid salt. Its universality made it political dynamite. This is the strange paradox of boring history. Salt is plain, unremarkable, and invisible on most pages of history books. And yet, without it, revolutions would have lacked some of their fuel. The French Revolution carried hatred of the gabelle. Gandhi's movement used salt as a spark. Even dynasties like the Han and Ming leaned on salt revenues to keep their rule intact. Today, salt is cheap and abundant. You can buy a kilogram for pocket change, but its legacy remains all around you. The word salary comes from salt. Ancient salt roads formed the foundations of modern highways, and political protests from France to India show how something so small can hold enormous symbolic power. Perhaps most fascinating is that salt's story is rarely told in grand histories. Kings, queens, generals, they dominate the stage, but behind them, armies marched only because food lasted. Empires endured only because supplies were preserved. Ordinary households survived winters only because barrels of meat and vegetables were salted. Salt was the quiet infrastructure of civilization. So, the next time you pass the salt at dinner, pause. You're holding the crystals that built empires, sparked revolutions, and carried entire civilizations on their backs. The empire of salt wasn't loud. It wasn't glorious. It was boring, and precisely for that reason. It was everywhere, and here's the final question. If salt plain, white, and forgettable could shape the course of history, what other boring things in your daily life might secretly be the foundations of our world? If you eat today, chances are you'll use a fork, a knife, or a spoon. But of the three, the spoon is the oldest, simplest, and most quietly revolutionary. It looks boring, a handle and a bowl, a tool so ordinary you barely notice it. Yet the spoon reflects survival, class, religion, and the way humans turned eating into culture. For most of human history, spoons weren't necessary. People ate with hands, fingers, or flat pieces of bread. Archaeologists find traces of this everywhere. Charred bread used as a scoop, bones licked clean. Communal stews shared directly from a pot, but as soon as liquids became central, broths, porridges, soups, hands no longer worked. You needed a tool. The first spoons were born not from luxury, but from survival. Imagine a Neolithic settlement 7,000 years ago. A clay pot bubbles over a fire. Inside, people gather with shells, carved wood, or animal bones fashioned into shallow scoops. That moment, when humans reached for a tool to sip hot broth, marks the beginning of one of history's quiet revolutions. The oldest known spoons date back to ancient Egypt, some over 3,000 years old. These weren't plain kitchen tools. They were carved from ivory and wood, decorated with hieroglyphs, sometimes even used as ritual objects. A spoon might carry offerings to the gods, not soup to a peasant's mouth. The Greeks and Romans had spoons too, though modest ones. Roman spoons often had pointed ends, useful for prying meat or cracking eggs. The cochlear, as it was called, was a common household tool, but it wasn't yet universal. Many Romans still ate with fingers. A spoon was a convenience, not a necessity. The fact that it survived through centuries shows just how practical it was. By the medieval period, spoons were everywhere in Europe, but not evenly. Wealthy nobles had spoons of silver, often engraved and personal. A lord might carry his spoon with him when traveling, the way you carry a phone today. It wasn't just a tool, it was a mark of identity. Meanwhile, peasants carved wooden spoons, passed down through generations. A family might own only a few, treasured and repaired. In some households, sharing a spoon was part of daily life, dipping into communal stews with one tool passed hand to hand. Meals weren't neat affairs. A wooden table, a bowl of pottage, and spoons scraping the bottom in unison. It was messy, monotonous, and ordinary, the texture of survival. Religion, too, shaped the spoon's place in culture. In Christian Europe, communion often involved a spoon to deliver wine-soaked bread. In Orthodox traditions, the spoon became a sacred tool, a way to share the Eucharist safely and equally. In other faiths, spoons carried symbolic roles as well. In Hindu rituals, spoons are used to pour offerings like ghee into sacred fires. In ancient China, bronze spoons sometimes accompanied burials, ensuring the dead could eat in the afterlife. So the spoon wasn't just for soup, it was for souls. One of the most overlooked details of spoon history is how it revealed class. To own a metal spoon, silver, pewter, brass, was a mark of status. Poorer households made do with wood, horn, or nothing at all. Even etiquette revolved around spoons. In medieval feasts, to have your own spoon was a sign of refinement. To lack one meant you relied on the host, acceptable, but less dignified. Imagine sitting at a long trestle table in a drafty hall, the rich flashing engraved silver spoons, while the poor dipped borrowed wooden ones. That tiny detail spoke volumes about hierarchy. Unlike forks, which spread slowly and awkwardly, spoons traveled easily. By the Renaissance, it was common to give spoons as gifts at christenings, weddings, and major life events. To give a spoon was to say, "May you always eat." Some spoons were engraved with initials, carried everywhere like wallets. The phrase "born with a silver spoon in one's mouth" comes from this, not as a literal birth, but as a symbol of inherited privilege. If you had silver spoons waiting for you, you had wealth and security. Here's what makes the spoon fascinating. It's boring. It doesn't shout like a sword or gleam like a crown. It hides in kitchens, drawers, and lunchboxes. But without it, much of daily life would have been messier, harder, and less dignified. Think of a peasant child in the 14th century, clutching a chipped wooden spoon, dipping into thin cabbage soup. Think of a noblewoman carefully using an ivory spoon inlaid with gems. Different worlds, same tool. The spoon leveled and divided at once. So the spoon, plain as it seems, carried civilizations from porridge fires to banquet halls. It was more than a utensil. It was survival, identity, and even faith. But here's the unresolved question. Did humans invent the spoon to control food? Or did the spoon, once created, begin to control how humans thought about eating itself? By the time Europe entered the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, spoons were no longer just tools for survival. They were social signals. To own one, to use one correctly, even to borrow one at the wrong time, could reveal class, manners, and hierarchy. If food was fuel, Spoons were the stage on which society decided who deserved what kind of dignity. Unlike today, medieval and Renaissance banquets didn't set the table with utensils for each guest. Instead, you brought your own. A well-traveled noble carried a small pouch with a spoon knife, and sometimes a two-pronged pick. This wasn't just convenience, it was status. Imagine a banquet in 15th century Florence. The host provides roasted meats, stews, and sweets. Guests arrive with polished spoons tucked into belts or hanging from chains. Pulling out a silver spoon engraved with your family crest wasn't only practical, it was a statement. You were prepared, refined, and wealthy enough to eat elegantly. Poorer guests, of course, brought wooden spoons, if they had any at all. Borrowing a host's spoon was possible, but marked you as dependent. A small detail, but one everyone at the table noticed. As dining grew more formal in the 16th and 17th centuries, spoons became part of an emerging code of etiquette. Manuals on proper behavior instructed diners how to use spoons without offense. Don't slurp. Drawing soup noisily was seen as crude. Don't double dip. In communal stews, dipping a spoon back after eating was considered rude, though common among peasants. Don't lick. A spoon should be wiped, not sucked clean. These may sound obvious today, but at the time, they were new rules. The spoon wasn't just shaping how people ate, it was teaching them discipline, restraint, and manners. Religious rituals also elevated spoons beyond daily eating. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the spoon became central to communion. Instead of placing bread directly into worshippers' hands, priests used a small spoon to administer the Eucharist, ensuring equality and hygiene in Hindu rituals. Long-handled spoons, often carved of wood or metal, were used to pour ghee into sacred fires, feeding the gods as humans fed themselves. The spoon was the bridge between divine offering and earthly nourishment. Even in funerary traditions, spoons mattered. Archaeologists find bronze and silver spoons in ancient burials from China to Scandinavia. A tool so ordinary in life was thought necessary in death. Perhaps the afterlife, too, required eating and dignity while doing it. By the Renaissance, spoons were popular gifts at major life events. Christening spoons, often made of silver, were presented to newborns as blessings of prosperity. Wedding spoons were engraved with names or dates, symbolizing shared meals for a lifetime. In Wales, carved cawl spoons, long-handled wooden spoons used for soup, became tokens of love. To gift a spoon wasn't just to offer a tool, but a wish. May you never go hungry. And then, of course, there's the phrase born with a silver spoon in one's mouth. It wasn't about literal birth. It meant being gifted wealth and security from the very start. If your first spoon was silver, your future was secure. If it was wood, life would be harder. A small object, but a sharp dividing line between classes. At great feasts, spoons often revealed social hierarchy more subtly than crowns or robes. Who had silver? Who had pewter? Who shared? In some courts, seating order was mirrored in utensils. The closer you sat to the host, the finer your spoon. At times, nobles deliberately flashed ornate spoons as signals of prestige. Spoons became quiet politics, a way to measure wealth without speaking. Even wars and rebellions occasionally touched spoons. During shortages, commoners accused elites of hoarding silver spoons while peasants starved. Symbolically, the spoon became a stand-in for inequality itself. But most spoon history wasn't grand. It was repetitive, ordinary, unnoticed. Day after day, millions of people dipped spoons into stews, porridges, or broths. Wooden spoons grew worn and smooth from years of scraping. Silver spoons passed through generations, outliving the people who first carried them. No drama, no spectacle. Just the quiet persistence of survival, mediated by a tool so plain it vanished into the background. This is where boring history hides, in the small motions repeated endlessly, shaping culture without fanfare. By the 17th and 18th centuries, forks were spreading across Europe. At first, they were controversial. Some saw them as unnecessary or even effeminate. The spoon, however, remained unquestioned. No matter how fancy dining became, soups, stews, and porridges still needed spoons. This tension is fascinating. The fork became the symbol of refinement, but the spoon remained the constant. To reject forks was possible. To reject spoons was unthinkable. Even today, when forks dominate Western tables, spoons hold their ground. So the spoon, simple as it seems, carried etiquette, class, ritual, and politics in its shallow bowl. It wasn't just a utensil. It was a marker of who you were, where you belonged, and how you should behave. But here's the unresolved question. Did spoons civilize humans by teaching manners? Or did humans invent manners to justify the quiet power spoons already held at the table? By the time the world entered the modern era, spoons had already been in human hands for thousands of years. They had carried porridge to Neolithic mouths, ladled offerings into temple fires, and glittered in Renaissance banquets. But the spoon's story didn't end in the Middle Ages. Instead, it quietly adapted to new foods, new cultures, and new ideas of what it meant to eat in the 18th and 19th centuries. Industrialization transformed spoon-making. Where once spoons were hand-carved from wood or hammered by silversmiths, factories now churned them out by the thousands. Pewter and tin gave way to stainless steel. Suddenly, spoons were no longer treasures passed through families. They were commodities. This democratization mattered. For the first time, even the poorest households could afford durable spoons. What had once been a mark of privilege became ordinary. A tool that once whispered class distinctions now spoke of sameness. The spoon became universal, and yet silver spoons remained symbols of status. Families still engraved initials, still presented them as christening gifts. Even as factories made spoons cheap, the rich found ways to keep them prestigious. If you think spoons simply adapted to food, think again. In many cases, spoons shaped the food itself. Breakfast cereals, popularized in the late 19th century, were designed to be eaten with spoons. Without the spoon, the idea of cornflakes or porridge as a neat, daily breakfast would have made little sense. Desserts like ice cream, custards, and puddings became staples, in part because spoons made them manageable. Imagine trying to eat soft, melting ice cream with a fork. Even medicine followed suit. Syrups and tonics were dosed by the spoonful, a measurement so ordinary it entered language itself. So the spoon didn't just serve meals, it created them. Those spoons became universal. Cultures shaped them differently. In China, spoons evolved into deep porcelain ladles, perfect for broth and noodles. Their stubby handles and wide bowls shaped the way soups were served and eaten. In Japan, wooden and lacquer spoons served alongside chopsticks, showing how cultures balanced different eating tools. In the Middle East, long-handled spoons served communal dishes, making sharing possible without contamination. In the West, spoons diversified: teaspoons, tablespoons, dessert spoons, soup spoons, demitasse spoons, each a tiny adaptation to specific foods and rituals. Wherever you go, the spoon bends to the culture's diet, but it never disappears. Spoons also left their mark in language. Born with a silver spoon still means privilege. To be spoon-fed implies learning passively, given everything without effort. Even affection borrows the spoon's shape. Lovers spoon when lying close together. In all of these, the spoon is shorthand for nurture, intimacy, and dependence. A knife may symbolize danger, a fork refinement, but the spoon always signals care. From feeding babies to serving the sick, the spoon is the utensil of gentleness. Even as dining customs shifted, spoons held their own. In fine dining, elaborate place settings still reserve multiple spoons for soups, desserts, and coffee. Using the wrong one may raise eyebrows, though the very existence of so many spoons is itself a legacy of the tool's flexibility. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, the simplest meals still depend on spoons. A bowl of rice and stew, oatmeal, or soup. Whether in a palace or a kitchen corner, the spoon remains indispensable. One of the strangest twists in the spoon's story is its modern reinvention as technology. Think of the humble measuring spoon in baking, standardized in the 20th century. It made recipes universal. Or the plastic disposable spoon, mass-produced to feed armies, schools, and fast food patrons. Even space travel embraced spoons. Astronauts use modified spoon-like tools to eat semi-solid food in zero gravity. The spoon, it seems, will travel wherever humans do. When you look back, the spoon has always been boring. It never inspired ballads or epics. It never gleamed on battlefields. But without it, survival would have been harder, food less manageable, rituals incomplete. Every clink of a spoon against a bowl is a reminder of a lineage stretching back millennia. From bone scoops in Neolithic fires to porcelain spoons in Chinese banquets, from christening gifts to cafeteria trays, the spoon has accompanied humanity every step of the way. So the spoon's story is quiet but vast. It shaped diets, rituals, etiquette, and even revolutions of class and industry. It is the most ordinary of tools, yet also the most universal. And here's the final reflection. If a simple spoon could shape how entire civilizations ate, prayed, and cared for one another, what other boring objects might still be silently guiding the way we live today? Today, you flip a switch and light floods the room. But for most of history, the battle against darkness was fought with fragile flames. Candles, small and ordinary, determined how people worked, worshipped, and survived the night. They are so plain, now scented, decorative, forgotten on shelves. But for centuries, candles were lifelines. They shaped when people slept, what they feared, how they prayed, and even how economies functioned. In the story of civilization, they are the quiet torchbearers. The story begins with fire itself. early humans relied on open flames, campfires, torches, or clay lamps filled with oil. These worked, but they were smoky, unreliable, and dangerous. Oil lamps, in particular, required steady supplies of olive oil or animal fat, resources that weren't always abundant. It was, in the ancient world, Rome, China, India, that candles first appeared as a simpler solution. Portable, self-contained light. The earliest Roman candles were made from tallow, animal fat rendered into waxy sticks. They stank when burned, smoking heavily, but they worked in China. Records mention candles made from whale fat as early as 200 BCE in India. Wax was drawn from boiled cinnamon for perfumed candles used in temples. Everywhere, the same problem produced the same tool. How do you bring light where light doesn't want to go? By the medieval period in Europe, candles had become central to daily survival. Imagine a peasant's cottage in the 12th century, dark, smoky, with small windows. At sunset, work had to stop unless a candle was lit. But candles were not cheap. For the poor, they were a luxury, saved for necessity. Nights were long, work ended early, and darkness ruled. For monasteries, candles were indispensable. Monks rose at all hours to pray, and stone abbeys glowed with hundreds of flickering flames. The rule of Saint Benedict even prescribed how many candles should burn during worship. Without them, devotion would have drowned in darkness. Meanwhile, for wealthier households, beeswax candles provided a cleaner, brighter flame than tallow. Their golden glow filled halls with light and status. To burn beeswax was not just practical, it was prestige. The need for candles gave rise to entire industries. Chandler's professional candle makers set up shops in towns and cities. Tallow was rendered from sheep or cattle, then poured into molds or repeatedly dipped to build long tapers. The smell was foul, but the product essential. Guilds regulated the trade. In England, for instance, candle making was so vital that laws dictated who could produce them and what materials could be used. Beeswax was often reserved for the church and nobility, while tallow was left for the common people. Even taxation entered the story. In some places, candles were taxed or restricted because controlling light meant controlling the rhythms of life itself. What strikes you, looking back, is how fragile this light was. A gust of wind could snuff out a candle, plunging a room into blackness. A careless hand could spill wax and start a fire. A single evening might require dozens of candles just to keep working. Picture a medieval scribe bent over a manuscript, his candle flickering dangerously close to the parchment. Every word copied was a race against darkness and fire. Or a family huddled around a single taper in a cottage, eking out just enough light to share a meal before bed. Candles were ordinary, yes, but they defined the edge between light and dark, between activity and rest, between safety and fear. Darkness in the pre-industrial world was not empty. It was alive with danger. Wolves prowled outside villages. Thieves used shadows as cover. Superstitions flourished in the dark. Candles were more than light. They were protection. Many believed that a burning candle warded off evil spirits. In Catholic tradition, candles symbolized divine presence, their flames representing Christ as the light of the world. Families lit candles during storms, births, and deaths, hoping the flames' glow would hold chaos at bay. Even funerals revolved around candles. To place them beside the dead was to guide souls through the dark. Without them, eternity itself seemed more frightening. And yet, for all this symbolism, most of candle history was boring routine. Housewives poured tallow, children trimmed wicks, servants carried trays of tapers from room to room. Every evening was punctuated by the quiet labor of making, lighting, and managing candles. It wasn't glamorous, but it structured existence. Daylight ended, but candles allowed just enough extension of time to read, pray, or work. Civilization itself was stretched by inches of wax, so the candle, humble and flickering, was not merely decoration. It was survival against the night, economy for cities, ritual for faith, and comfort against fear. But here's the unresolved question. Did humans truly master the dark with candles? Or did candles only remind them how fragile their light still was? If Section 1 showed how candles extended survival into the night, Section 2 shows how they became more than light. Across centuries, candles were woven into rituals, ceremonies, and superstitions. A flickering flame wasn't just fire, it was presence, protection, and meaning. Candles may have been ordinary in homes, but in sacred spaces, they carried extraordinary weight. Christianity, in Catholic and Orthodox traditions, candles came to symbolize the divine light of Christ. Altars glowed with beeswax candles, their steady flames seen as prayers rising to heaven. At baptisms, a candle was placed in the hands of the newly christened, a symbol of enlightenment. At funerals, candles guided the soul through the darkness of death. Even today, lighting a candle in a church feels like stepping into centuries of continuity. Judaism. The Sabbath begins with the lighting of candles. Their glow marks the transition from work to rest, from the ordinary to the sacred. Hanukkah revolves around light candles on the menorah, reminding of endurance and divine presence. Hinduism and Buddhism, candles or oil lamps illuminate temples and shrines, their flames representing the destruction of ignorance and the presence of the divine. During Diwali, millions of small flames, candles, or clay lamps push back the darkness across India in every faith. The candle carried the same paradox, fragile, fleeting, and yet eternal in its symbolism. Beyond religion, candles flickered in folklore and superstition, warding off evil. Many believed a burning candle kept spirits away. In parts of Europe, candles were lit during thunderstorms to protect homes from lightning. Often blessed candles, thought to carry special power, divination in folk magic. Dripping candle wax into water revealed symbols for the future. The way a flame flickered or smoked could be read as omens of good or ill, life and death. A candle flame was often thought to mirror a person's soul. If it burned steady, life was secure. If it sputtered, death approached. To blow out a candle carelessly was sometimes seen as an insult to the divine. In these beliefs, the candle wasn't just light, it was alive, watching, responding from cradle to grave. Candles marked life's milestones, births. Families lit candles to protect mothers in labor, believing the flame shielded against spirits that preyed on vulnerable lives. Marriage. In many cultures, wedding ceremonies included the lighting of candles, two flames becoming one, symbolizing union. Death. Perhaps no moment leaned more heavily on candles than funerals. Rooms of the dead glowed with candlelight, as if to guide souls across a dark river. Even today, to light a candle for the departed is to whisper hope into the shadows. Candles were not just tools, they were companions through the most fragile moments of human existence. What made candles so powerful was their vulnerability. Unlike the sun, a candle could be snuffed out in an instant. That fragility mirrored life itself. To stare at a candle was to confront mortality, brief light, then darkness. Medieval poets often used candles as metaphors for human life, flickering, brief, consumed as it burns. A candle gave light only by destroying itself. Perhaps that is why it seemed sacred. It embodied sacrifice. Candles also created shared experience. In medieval towns, processions wound through streets by candlelight. Entire cities glowed during feasts or holy days. A sea of flames was more than illumination, it was identity. People saw themselves as part of a greater light. Even ordinary households embraced communal rituals. To sit by candlelight at evening meals was to gather as a family, the glow softening shadows, shrinking fear, and binding people together. The candle was less about brightness than about intimacy. Yet behind all the symbolism lay the boring work. Wicks had to be trimmed constantly. Wax dripped messily onto tables. Candles guttered and smoked, staining walls with soot. For servants, maintaining candles was daily drudgery, replacing, lighting, snuffing, cleaning. For families, rationing them was constant calculation. How many could be burned tonight without running short tomorrow? The sacred flame was also labor, expense, and routine. This is where boring history hides behind every glowing ritual was the invisible work of keeping that flame alive. Candles embodied contradictions. They were sacred and ordinary. They comforted, but also frightened. They revealed truth, but could mislead through superstition, and they shaped human time itself. Without candles, night was endless. With them, humans carved pockets of light, reshaping darkness into ritual, work, and community. So the candle wasn't just a stick of wax. It was ritual, omen, prayer, and presence. Its flame guided souls, protected homes, and gave meaning to ordinary nights. But here's the unresolved question. Did humans give candles their sacred power? Or did the fragile flame itself, always flickering, always mortal, demand reverence all on its own? By the 18th and 19th centuries, candles had already been humanity's quiet guardians for millennia. But their reign as rulers of the night was about to end. With the rise of new technologies, gas lamps, oil lanterns, and, eventually, electricity, candles began their long decline. They didn't disappear, though. Instead, they transformed from survival tools into symbols, luxuries, and comforts that still flicker in our lives today. The first great challenger to the candle was whale oil. By the late 1700s, whaling industries supplied lamps with oil that burned brighter and longer than tallow or beeswax. Cities glowed with lamps fueled by whales hunted across oceans. For the wealthy, chandeliers of oil lamps replaced clusters of candles. Then came gaslight. In the early 19th century, cities like London and Paris installed gas lamps along streets. For the first time, entire urban centers glowed at night. To walk through a gaslit city was to see darkness itself retreat. Candles, once the rulers of night, began to look feeble. The final blow came with Edison's light bulb in 1879. Electricity spread rapidly in industrial nations, bringing light that was steady, safe, and cheap. Candles could no longer compete. By the 20th century, they were no longer necessities, but relics. Imagine the shift. For centuries, families rationed candles, counting each taper carefully. Now, a single switch could flood a room with light at almost no cost. Darkness, once feared and managed with effort, became optional. The candle, humanity's old companion, was suddenly obsolete, and yet candles never disappeared. They simply changed roles. Religion, churches still burn candles for prayer, remembrance, and ritual. The symbolism of flame, fragile yet eternal, cannot be replaced by a light bulb. Celebration, birthday, cakes glow with candles, each flame a wish, a ritual of life's continuity. Weddings, vigils, and memorials still rely on candlelight to create solemnity and intimacy, romance and atmosphere. Even in a world of neon and LED, candlelight remains the gold standard for intimacy. A dinner by candlelight feels different, softer, slower, more human. Candles survived not because of necessity, but because of meaning. In the modern world, the candle became a luxury good. Instead of plain tallow, candles are now scented, colored, and decorative. They no longer just burn, they evoke. A lavender-scented candle promises calm. A luxury brand candle becomes a status symbol, echoing the old days when beeswax marked wealth. Factories mass-produce millions, but the aura of intimacy remains. Lighting a candle in a home is still an act of presence, a signal that this moment is set apart. Even in their decline, candles retain a practical role in emergencies. Power outages send families scrambling for candles, rediscovering their ancestors' nightly dependence. In disasters, candles once again become survival, fragile, dangerous, but better than nothing. It's in those moments, when electricity fails, that we remember what the world once was. A place where light came only in small, flickering portions. And here is the boring truth. Candles persisted not through glory, but through habit. People kept lighting them even after lamps arrived, even after electricity spread. They burned them for rituals, for remembrance, for comfort. No revolution, no resistance, just the quiet survival of a tradition too human to abandon. Day after day, century after century, someone lit a candle, trimmed a wick, or watched wax drip. The act was so ordinary it became invisible, yet it carried civilization through darkness. Candles are paradoxes. They give light, but consume themselves. They symbolize eternity, yet vanish in minutes. They are fragile, flickering, boring, yet essential to humanity's sense of warmth and meaning. Even now, in an age of electric brilliance, you still light them at moments when you want life to slow down, to feel sacred, to feel close. Candles no longer fight the night. They shape the human spirit. So the candle's story begins in survival, passes through ritual, and ends in symbolism. From dark cottages to glittering cathedrals, from whale oil to light bulbs, the candle always flickered at the edge of history. And here's the final thought. If a simple flame once carried the weight of civilization, what other technologies of today, things we take for granted, things that seem plain, will someday be remembered as the quiet keepers of our age. You don't notice locks until they fail. A key slips, a bolt jams, or a door stays shut when it shouldn't. But for thousands of years, locks have been silent guardians of survival. They don't look glorious, just lumps of wood, iron, or brass. Yet they reshaped how humans lived, traded, and trusted one another. Before locks, there was only trust or fear. To keep food safe, you had to sleep beside it. To protect goods, you had to guard them with your body. Locks changed that. Suddenly, security could be mechanical, not personal. They freed people to leave, to travel, to sleep without watching. In their quiet way, locks made civilization possible. The oldest known locks were found in the ruins of Nineveh and ancient Egypt, dating back over 4,000 years. They were massive wooden devices, often as long as your arm. Imagine a sliding bolt with holes drilled into it. Wooden pins dropped down, holding it in place. A key, also wooden, lifted the pins, allowing the bolt to slide open. It was bulky, crude, and easily broken. But it was revolutionary. For the first time, an object, not a guard, could decide who had access. A wooden lock on a granary door meant food could be stored, shared, and trusted to remain safe. The Greeks and Romans refined the idea, turning locks into smaller, more practical devices. Roman engineers created metal locks with wards, projections that only the correct key could bypass. Keys themselves became smaller, sometimes worn as rings. Picture a Roman merchant walking through the forum with a ring on his finger. That ring wasn't jewelry. It was a key to his storeroom, his home, his wealth. To carry it was to carry authority. Locks spread with the empire. Villas, shops, and warehouses across the Mediterranean relied on them. They weren't invincible thieves, could still break them, but they symbolized ownership in a new way by the Middle Ages. Locks grew heavier, more ornate, and more symbolic. Castles had massive iron locks on gates and chests. Monasteries locked reliquaries and libraries. Towns used locks on their granaries, gates, and treasuries. Craftsmanship flourished. Blacksmiths designed elaborate mechanisms, not only to secure, but to impress. A noble chest might have a lock with hidden levers or disguised keyholes. Some locks were so complex they served less as barriers and more as demonstrations of wealth. A lock that said, "Only I can afford this." For peasants, locks were simpler: wooden bolts, crude iron latches, rope knots. Yet even these made a difference. A locked barn meant livestock was safer. A locked coffer meant savings could accumulate. For the first time, the poorest could protect what little they had without constant vigilance. Locks did more than protect things. They created trust at a distance. In markets, traders stored goods in locked chests, confident they'd still be there tomorrow. In towns, guilds locked their halls, ensuring only members had access. Locks allowed cooperation because they made theft less tempting. Even today, the phrase "under lock and key" doesn't just mean safe, it means trustworthy. The presence of a lock reassures, even if the lock itself can be broken. Most of lock history isn't about thieves or heroes. It's about repetition. Keys turning every evening. Bolts sliding into place. Chests opened at dawn, closed at dusk. Ordinary people locked their barns, shop doors, and grain stores every single day. These motions, so small, so boring, structured entire lives. They gave rhythm to survival. Open, close, secure, sleep. A child carrying a key to lock animals for the night was performing an act of civilization as important as plowing fields. But locks also revealed social divides. The wealthy commissioned ornate locks from master smiths, while the poor relied on knots and crude latches. A silver key might symbolize status as much as a crown. In some towns, only the ruling elite held the keys to city gates, a reminder of who controlled access to safety. Locks democratized security, but they also reinforced inequality. To hold the key was to hold power, so the first locks, clumsy wooden and iron devices, did more than keep doors shut. They reshaped human trust, allowed goods to be stored, and let people rest without constant fear. But here's the unresolved question. Were locks truly about keeping people out? Or were they really about giving owners the illusion of control in a world where theft and danger never fully disappeared? Locks weren't only pieces of hardware. They were metaphors, symbols, and rituals, shaping how people thought about secrecy, ownership, and even love. Across cultures, the simple act of locking and unlocking took on meanings far deeper than security. From the earliest cities, keys carried prestige. They weren't just tools, they were symbols of authority. Medieval towns, mayors or guildmasters were often presented with keys to the city, literal iron keys to the gates. Handing them over was a gesture of trust or submission. To hold the keys was to hold power. The Catholic Church, the papacy, adopted keys as its most enduring symbol. St. Peter, tradition said, held the keys to heaven. To this day, the papal coat of arms displays two crossed keys, one gold, one silver, symbolizing divine authority. Households in noble families. The lady of the house often carried the keys to storerooms and chests. Her belt jingled with iron and brass, each key representing her responsibility for the household's wealth and supplies. Everywhere, the key was more than metal. It was a badge of trust, a visible sign of responsibility. Locks also transformed the very idea of privacy. In ancient homes, there were few true private spaces, but once locks became common, chests, cupboards, and eventually rooms could be secured. For merchants, this meant ledgers and contracts could be hidden. For nobles, it meant letters and treasures were kept from prying eyes. For ordinary people, it meant small personal belongings, clothes, tools, keepsakes, could finally be mine in a tangible sense. The lock created a boundary between the public and the private. It wasn't always perfect, but it was enough to change how people thought about ownership. Strangely, locks also slipped into rituals of affection. Even in the Middle Ages, there are references to lovers exchanging keys as tokens of intimacy. To give someone a key wasn't just to grant them access to a chest or room. It was to grant them trust. Fast forward centuries, and this symbolism endures. Today, couples still lock their love by fastening padlocks to bridges and throwing away the key, a modern ritual with ancient echoes. The lock, meant for exclusion, becomes a symbol of union. In folklore, locks weren't purely mechanical. They could be magical. In parts of Europe, witches were said to be able to lock up a person's strength or fertility using enchanted padlocks. Rituals sometimes involved locking an object away to curse an enemy, or unlocking one to release blessing. A locked chest could symbolize hidden knowledge, an image that appears in myths. From Pandora's box to treasure stories, the lock became shorthand for mystery. What is hidden, forbidden, or dangerous? Its physical mechanics inspired entire metaphors of secrecy. The design of a lock itself often became a marker of wealth. Nobles commissioned ornate locks with gilded plates and elaborate wards, less for protection than for display. Some locks were disguised, hidden inside intricate carvings or sculptures. A Renaissance chest might have a lock so cleverly concealed that opening it became a performance, a reminder to guests of the owner's wealth and sophistication. In this way, locks were as much about showing security as providing it. But beneath the ceremonies, romances, and superstitions, there was still the monotony. Locks had to be maintained, wards clogged with dust, keys bent, iron rusted. Servants oiled hinges, blacksmiths filed teeth into broken keys. Children fetched replacements. The glamour of a key to the city, or a lover's token, rested on the backs of thousands of unnoticed daily acts, sliding bolts, turning keys, checking latches. Civilization's privacy and trust were built on boring routine. Language absorbed the symbolism of locks, to lock away secrets, to key into knowledge, to hold the key to power. Even in ordinary speech, the lock and key became the go-to metaphors for mystery, control, and responsibility. This wasn't accidental. People lived with locks constantly. Their rhythm of life, open in the morning, lock at night, became a mental framework for everything from government to religion. So locks weren't just mechanical barriers. They were ceremonies of trust, metaphors of secrecy, symbols of intimacy, and tools of superstition. They shaped how people imagined ownership, love, and even access to heaven itself. But here's the unresolved question. Did humans invent locks to protect what mattered? Or did locks slowly teach humans what it meant to matter in the first place? By the 18th and 19th centuries, locks had been with humanity for millennia. Wooden bolts in Egyptian granaries, iron wards on Roman doors, ornate chest locks in medieval castles, all had carried civilization through theft, trade, and trust. But the modern age transformed locks from clumsy mechanics into precision tools, and eventually into something almost invisible, ideas of access and identity themselves. The Industrial Revolution was not just about factories and machines. It was also about locks. Advances in metallurgy and mass production made locks stronger, smaller, and more reliable. One of the most famous breakthroughs was the Chubb detector lock, invented in 1818 in England. Unlike earlier locks, which could be picked by a skilled hand, the Chubb lock contained a mechanism that jammed if tampered with. It was marketed not just as a tool, but as peace of mind. Around the same time, Joseph Bramah's lock gained fame for its complexity. So confident was Bramah in its security that he displayed one in his shop window with a challenge. Anyone who could pick it would win a prize. It took 67 years before a locksmith finally did. Locks were no longer crude barriers. They became feats of engineering, symbols of precision in an age of invention. Industrialization also democratized locks. Where once only nobles or wealthy merchants could could afford strong iron locks. Factories now produced millions of affordable padlocks. Farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers could secure barns, doors, and toolboxes with the same reliability once reserved for elites. This universality changed daily life. A worker in Manchester could leave his tools overnight with confidence. A grocer in Paris could close up shop and sleep without fear. Locks were no longer luxuries. They were part of the basic rhythm of modern life. By the late 19th century, the padlock had become the most recognizable form of lock worldwide. Portable, cheap, and effective, it secured gates, lockers, warehouses, and shipping crates. Travelers carried them on trunks. Factories used them on machinery. Soldiers marched with padlocks on their packs. The image of a closed padlock became so universal that even today, in the digital world, we use it as the symbol for online security. As cities swelled and life became more crowded, locks also grew tied to the idea of personal privacy. Apartment doors, desk drawers, filing cabinets, each had its lock. Letters and diaries came with tiny keys, sold not only as protection, but as promises of secrecy. To lock something was no longer just to prevent theft. It was to create a space of the self. A diary with a key taught children the idea of privacy. A locked office drawer gave professionals their own world inside the chaos of a city. By the 20th century, the world was already imagining locks in new forms. Combination locks replaced keys with numbers. Safes used dials instead of bolts. Eventually, electronics turned locks into codes, cards, and fingerprints. But notice what didn't change: the metaphor. Even on the internet, the image of a padlock sits in your browser bar when a site is secure. The phrase locked account or unlocking content shows how deeply locks are tied to our sense of safety and access. In truth, the mechanical lock gave birth to a mental framework, the idea that trust can be managed by barriers, and that identity can be proven by possession of a key. Even in modern times, locks retain symbolic roles beyond security. Couples attach padlocks to bridges as signs of love, tossing keys into rivers as vows of permanence. Protesters sometimes chain gates with padlocks as acts of resistance, their clink of iron a reminder of defiance. The lock has outlived its function. It has become an icon of commitment, loyalty, and rebellion. For all the technology, though most of lock history remains boring repetition. People turning keys every morning, students snapping padlocks on lockers, shopkeepers closing shutters. Millions of tiny motions, unnoticed, shaping trust day after day. Civilization runs on these small acts. Locks aren't glorious, but they are constant, the quiet ticks of security against chaos. So the lock's story spans wooden bolts in ancient Egypt, ornate wards in castles, precision mechanics in the industrial age, and padlock icons on digital screens. They are the quiet guardians of human trust, never perfect, always bypassable, but always present. And here's the final reflection. If locks are less about barriers than about belief, the faith that something is safe when we walk away, then maybe the true story of locks is not about keeping others out, but about convincing ourselves that we can finally rest. You probably don't think about shoes unless they hurt. They're so ordinary sitting by the door, scattered across hallways, waiting in closets. But for most of history, shoes weren't fashion. They were survival. A simple sole of leather or bark could mean the difference between life and frostbite, between marching an army or limping home. Shoes are boring. They don't sparkle like crowns or blaze like swords, but without them, civilization would have blistered to a halt. The earliest evidence of shoes dates back over 10,000 years. Archaeologists in Oregon discovered imprints of woven sandals in caves, strips of sagebrush bark twisted into soles. They were crude, fragile, and utilitarian, but they mattered. Humans evolved barefoot, but bare feet wear down quickly on rock, ice, or desert sand. Shoes extended range, protected skin, and made survival less brutal. A woven sandal may look unimpressive in a museum case, but for its wearer, it meant fewer infections, fewer cuts, and more miles. By 2000 BCE, shoes were already status markers. Egyptian nobles wore sandals of leather or papyrus, some decorated with gold. Pharaohs strode in pairs that servants carried behind them, polished and pristine. Commoners, meanwhile, often went barefoot. Shoes were as much about class as comfort in Mesopotamia. Soldiers wore sturdy leather boots, laced up the calves, practical for rough terrain. Farmers tied rawhide around their feet in the fields. Already, shoes were dividing lives. Bare feet for the poor, decorated soles for the rich, armored boots for warriors. The Greeks perfected the sandal. From simple strapped soles to the famous cothurnus boots worn by actors on stage, footwear became part of identity. Philosophers wandered Athens in light sandals. Soldiers strapped heavier versions for war. But shoes weren't universal. Many Greeks still went barefoot, even by choice. To walk barefoot was seen as tough, virtuous, even philosophical. Socrates himself was known for refusing shoes, an act of quiet defiance against luxury. So even in antiquity, shoes weren't just protection, they were statements. No civilization depended on shoes more than Rome. The Roman caliga, heavy-soled military boots with iron hobnails, carried legions across continents. Roads and empires mean little if soldiers can't march, and Rome's armies marched because their feet endured. Roman citizens, too, distinguished themselves by shoes. Red-dyed boots marked senators. Slaves were often barefoot. To look at a person's feet was to read their place in society. And the Romans left another legacy, the shoemakers' guild, organized, regulated, and essential. These craftsmen ensured that shoes were not just tools, but industries. In medieval Europe, shoes diversified. Peasants wore rough leather tied with thongs, practical and plain. Nobles paraded in long pointed shoes, palanes so exaggerated that some had tips nearly 2 feet long. These weren't meant for walking, but for showing status. Shoes became part of moral debates. Priests denounced fashionable footwear as vanity. Sumptuary laws in some cities restricted shoe shapes by class. A peasant in extravagant boots could be fined. Even in footwear, hierarchy pressed down, but beneath the extravagance. Ordinary shoes kept daily life trudging forward. Farmers in muddy fields, shepherds on hillsides, laborers in towns. Millions of forgotten steps on worn leather soles made medieval life possible. What's striking is how essential shoes were in environments of extreme cold or heat. In Northern Europe, fur-lined boots protected against frostbite. In deserts, sandals shielded feet from blistering sand. On mountains, shoes meant the difference between climbing and bleeding. Everywhere, the story repeats. Shoes were boring, repetitive, ordinary, and absolutely essential. By now, shoes weren't just tools. They were identity markers. In many cultures, removing shoes before entering homes or temples became a ritual of respect. Shoes carried dirt, the outside world, labor. To remove them was to recognize boundaries between sacred and profane. This is why shoes appear so often in religious symbolism. In the Bible, Moses removes his sandals at the burning bush. In Islamic tradition, shoes are left outside mosques. In Japan, sandals are set aside at the threshold, replaced by indoor slippers. The act is universal. Shoes protect, but they also separate. For most of history, though shoe life was dull, repairs were constant. Soles wore thin. Stitching came loose. Cobblers patched and resoled endlessly. A peasant's life was measured in the slow wearing out of shoes, each pair carrying months of toil before giving way to modern eyes. It may seem trivial, but to them, a good pair of shoes could mean a season of survival. So shoes, humble and worn, carried humanity from deserts to mountains, from palaces to fields. They protected, signaled, divided, and endured. But here's the unresolved question. Did humans shape shoes to fit their journeys? Or did shoes shape human journeys by deciding how far we could go? Shoes protect feet, but they also carry meaning. Across centuries, footwear has been loaded with symbolism, holy or sinful, humble or extravagant, a marker of devotion, wealth or rebellion. What you wore on your feet told others who you were or who you pretended to be. The act of taking shoes off has always been more than practical, sacred ground. In the Bible, Moses is told to remove his sandals before the burning bush because the ground is holy. The message is clear. Shoes carry the dust of ordinary life, and holiness requires bare humility. Mosques and temples. In Islam, shoes are left at the mosque entrance. In Japan, slippers replace sandals indoors. Shoes are barriers. They protect, but they also defile. Removing them is a sign of respect. Christian tradition. In medieval monasteries, monks often went barefoot or wore simple sandals to embody humility. Meanwhile, bishops and popes wore special slippers as marks of their office. To kiss the pope's shoe was to acknowledge his authority. The shoe was never just leather. It was a boundary between sacred and profane. Few objects made social divides more visible than shoes. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, nobles paraded in long pointed shoes called poulaines. Some stretched so far that wearers had to tie the ends to their legs with chains to walk. These weren't practical, they were pure status. Peasants slogged through mud in rough boots, while nobles teetered around in absurd footwear that declared, "I don't need to work." Authorities noticed. Sumptuary laws often restricted shoe length and decoration. In England, laws once limited shoe points by class. Commoners' shoes could extend only a few inches, while nobles flaunted theirs extravagantly. A person's rank could be measured from the ground up. Shoes also carried moral judgments. Priests condemned long, showy footwear as vanity, mocking nobles for worshipping fashion over function. Writers sneered at shoes that walked into sin. A simple sandal symbolized humility and piety, while extravagant boots represented pride. This moral tension persisted for centuries. Even today, expensive shoes spark judgments, admired by some, scorned by others as symbols of excess. The old debate about footwear as virtue or vanity has never quite gone away. Footwear also reflected gender roles. In many cultures, women's shoes emphasized delicacy or restriction, while men's shoes emphasized strength and mobility. In China, foot binding transformed shoes into prisons, crushing women's feet into lotus shapes to meet beauty ideals. These tiny shoes, ornate and embroidered, symbolize status but also control. In Europe, noble women often wore high Japanese platform shoes so tall they required attendants to help them walk. The higher the chapin, the higher the status. Practical? Not at all. But they declared wealth loudly. Men's shoes, by contrast, emphasized power. Military boots, riding boots, sturdy soles. The divide was clear. Mobility for men, restriction for women. Shoes were not just tools. They were statements of power and identity. Stories and legends also turned shoes into symbols. Cinderella, a lost slipper, defines her fate, a reminder that shoes can signal identity and destiny. Boots. European folktales gave heroes magical boots to travel impossible distances, symbolizing ambition and freedom, shoes and punishment. In some cultures, being forced to walk barefoot was humiliation. To remove someone's shoes was to strip them of dignity. Shoes walked through stories as more than leather. They were metaphors for journeys, trials, and transformations. For all the symbolism, daily life still centered on the boring rituals of shoes, tying laces, pulling on boots, cleaning mud. In villages, children padded barefoot until the harvest bought them new shoes. In cities, cobblers hammered endlessly, resole after resole, repairing what could not be replaced. These mundane actions carried just as much meaning as the pomp of noble poulains. Every pair of shoes told a story. How hard the road was, how long the workday lasted, how much life pressed down on each step. Perhaps most importantly, shoes created boundaries. They marked where one life ended and another began, sacred versus profane, rich versus poor, humble versus proud. Every time someone slipped off shoes at a doorway or tied on boots for a journey, they crossed a threshold. The shoe became the mediator between the human body and the world, the silent witness to everything humans endured. So shoes were never just leather and soles. They were rituals, symbols, arguments, and status markers. They told stories of humility and vanity, of gender and class, of love and power. But here's the unresolved question. Were shoes simply practical objects that gained meaning? Or were they always destined to be symbols because every step we take leaves a mark on the world? By the dawn of the 19th century, shoes had already walked humanity through deserts, fields, and palaces. But the Industrial Revolution transformed them from slow, handcrafted necessities into global commodities. What once took a cobbler hours with leather and nails could now be stamped, sewn, and shipped by the thousands. Shoes became cheaper, more varied, and more symbolic than ever before. For centuries, shoes were crafted one pair at a time. A cobbler measured your foot, cut leather, and stitched soles by hand. Repairs were constant. Most people wore the same pair for years, mended until nothing remained but scraps. Industrial machines changed everything. Factories could punch out hundreds of pairs a day, sizes standardized instead of tailored. Shoes became disposable, not heirlooms. The cobbler's hammer, once the heartbeat of every village, slowly fell silent as mass production spread.